If you join with us in our sermon reading, Matthew 28, verses 5 through 6, fairly short, fairly powerful. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." And of course, the women looked into an empty tomb. This morning, I'm going to read a scripture for you, Ephesians 1, 18 to 20. And here's what Paul writes for us. "I pray that the eyes of your hearts would be enlightened to know the hope that you have, and that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us in our lives. It is the same mighty power that that raised Jesus from the dead and seated him at God's right hand in heaven." I want us to think about that mighty power today for our lives, the power of an empty tomb. And today I want us to recognize the power that God can work amazing things into our lives. Healing, hope, strength, recovery, forgiveness, to be set free, the power to live in newness of life. It's all revealed through an empty tomb and a resurrection. Today, I'm also going to be speaking some, I guess what you would call apologetics, which literally means, it's a Greek word that means faith. Basically, it means speaking in defense of something. Namely for us today, Easter, resurrection, life. Now, there's a famous saying that's out there, and you might have heard this before. It says, "Faith is belief without evidence." And that's somewhat true. But you see, I think there's more to that. I don't think that's the full definition of what faith is about, because then I hear people say, well, faith is belief without evidence. Since there's no evidence out there, then you just have to take faith, and how foolish to believe in something like faith. But the reality is, I believe that faith comes through evidence and belief as well. It's about the head and the heart as we take a look at these things. You see, I believe that we can look at a story like an empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus, and I think there could be credible evidence as well as eyewitness testimony that can draw us to faith and belief in the midst of it. Today we celebrate a resurrection of Jesus that took place almost 2,000 years ago. For some, this is just a complete fable. It's no big deal. For some, they just say it's just unbelievable. There's no reason to even believe in it. For some people, they say it doesn't really matter. It's not important enough to draw it into my daily life and begin to live anything with it. But for some of us, this is powerful stuff. This is what our lives are about. This is why we show up to a church on an Easter Sunday morning. Whereas Christianity is always going to have elements of faith involved, I want us to see that we have good reason to believe in the resurrection. And if we have good reason to believe in a resurrection, then the real question becomes for us, how does the truth of Easter and the resurrection affect my life? What am I supposed to do with this thing called Easter? Where do I go with this? Some of you may know, many of you may not, a man by the name of Brian Head Welch. Brian Head Welch is the lead guitarist for a group called Korn. And this is a man who was in a place of his life where he's in complete depression, completely drug addicted in so many ways, and really wanted suicide. And he was going to commit suicide. This was the end. It was done. And somebody invited him to church. And when he went to church, he met Jesus. And here's what he writes for Easter for us today. He says, "I know personally that Jesus is resurrected because Jesus has resurrected my life in power, and I'm living in it right now." See, that's the power of the resurrection within our lives. Matthew is going to be showing us really different reactions to Easter. He's going to show us reactions from the guards, from the religious leaders, from the women, from the disciples. So we have to begin to look at this and say, how did the resurrection affect them? How is the resurrection supposed to affect us? And can we truly believe in this thing called a resurrection and an empty tomb? I don't want to go into this because the last few weeks, I've been talking about textual integrity of the Greek New Testament. I've been talking about the fact that the Greek New Testament is seen as one of the most reliable ancient historical documents that there is as far as the original Greek. And, I could go through all the statistics about it, when it was written, which was just a handful of years after Jesus was alive and had died and came back and the resurrection. I could give all kinds of evidences that there's over 5,000 manuscripts, and they brought these manuscripts together, and it's been 99+% accurate. And they say, we fully believe this, as the Greek New Testament, is something that is credible. A credible ancient historical document. And we believe it's very empirical evidence that we are getting the story in an accurate way. And what I mean by that is this. This is how the writer wrote it and what the author's intentions were as he wrote it. Now, there's still got to be an element of faith in it because they're still writing about things that happened 2,000 years ago. That's history. But there's still an element of faith in the midst of it that we've got to get a hold of. But what I want us to see today is that when it comes to the resurrection, there is what I believe to be credible evidences. And I had this so cool. I had these 1 through 4. They were going to go bouncing in all in different times, and I was talking and stuff, but it's not working for some reason. So you just have to see them all right away. But here's where we're going to start. The first credible evidence, I think, is the eyewitnesses. Eyewitness testimony. The 11 saw him, the women saw Jesus, 2 on the road to Emmaus. Acts 1 through 3, there's probably 100, maybe 120 who are there and able to see. And then, of course, when Pentecost comes, they're in the upper room, and it starts this whole movement. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says there are 500 plus people many of whom he says are still alive, who have seen Jesus alive. Now, 1 Corinthians, the letter itself was written about 50 CE of the Common Era, which is only about 25 years after Jesus' life. So many of those persons, it was so easy. They could have done and said, okay, here's 500 plus people. Go find them and ask them. They're eyewitnesses. They'll tell you, and if it wasn't true, they'd say, that's baloney. There's no way. But you see that he says they're there. So if you're going to throw eyewitnesses out, 500 of them, either there's a great conspiracy, or they're really good liars, or something happened and 500 people saw something like a resurrected Jesus. Eyewitness testimony was there as they wrote it. Number 2 is Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Now, these 2 men, we find out in John 19, that they took the body off the cross and ended up burying Jesus in a tomb. These men were part of what's known as the Sanhedrin, which was kind of this ruling class. They were a Sadducee and a Pharisee. Today would be kind of like the senators or congresspersons, and there's a religious element to it in the midst of it as well, and like the priests of the day. These people were powerful, well-respected, well-known persons within the entire nation. Do you think they could have perpetuated a lie in these persons' names and gotten away with it? Would never have happened. So here are these persons saying this is what happened. The testimony is that Jesus died and he was buried in Joseph's tomb. And it's truly because of Joseph and Nicodemus that scholars today, whether they're believers or non-believers, see Jesus' death and burial as an historical event. This thing happened because we trust that these powerful people told the truth here. Number 3, the women. This is one of my favorites. You ready? In first century Palestine, women had no social standing. Their testimony was ignored, and they couldn't even give testimony in court. So the fact that the Bible lists the women as the first ones to see a resurrected Jesus lends powerful credibility to the whole story. And you say, well, how? Well, here's why. Because to list women as eyewitnesses is completely counterproductive and counterintuitive. Why would you put down, here's the first persons that saw Jesus, women, when they say we don't even trust the women, that they would say that? Why would you say something like that? There's only one reason why you would. It was the truth. Why else would you say something counterproductive and counterintuitive? Only one reason. It's what really happened. And the Bible's honest. It says, hey, the women were the first ones who saw. The women were the first ones who went to the tomb. And they saw Jesus. There's no other conceivable reason to list women unless it's true eyewitness testimony. The last one is really the origin of the Christian movement, which is really inexplicable apart from a resurrection. See, most critics will concede that there was a death of a man named Jesus, there was an empty tomb, there was this subsequent belief, and then this movement that just literally took over the world behind that. There were 11, there were 120, there were 500 witnesses. Pretty soon there were thousands who would spend their lives witnessing, traveling, losing their jobs, not making money, not finding fame in the midst of this. In fact, Paul writes in one of his letters, he says, to the world, we are the scum of the earth. Isn't that the nice thing to be? That's who we are following Jesus. They were being persecuted, arrested, beaten, tortured, and martyred, all for a lie that they knew wasn't true. Does that make sense? How many of you, even for the truth, you can't get somebody to go through suffering today, yet for a lie that you know isn't truth, you're going to go through all this? That makes no sense whatsoever. These people gained nothing in this world. They lost everything in this world. Now, we know that Nero into the first century, the Emperor Nero, was doing horrible things to Christians at this time. We know that they were throwing them, in the Colosseum, they were throwing them out for lions to devour. We hear stories of Nero, who was such a, it's almost like stories of even worse than as mad as ISIS today. They would take Christians, literally pour tar upon them, impale them, and then light them on fire so that Nero could have his gardens lit up at night. That's what he was doing. They would take animal skins and sew them into people's skin, and they would send them out running, and they would send wild dogs to tear them to shreds for game and sport. Now, how many of you are ready to go through that kind of persecution and torture and martyrdom for a lie that you know just isn't true? See, it makes no sense. The only reason that something would move in that direction underneath that kind of persecution and torture and martyrdom is that there was credible evidence of a resurrection that was true, and they were empowered to go do what they did. So Matthew's just piling up evidence upon evidence, argument upon argument that Jesus was resurrected. And his greatest argument doesn't come from the disciples, it doesn't come from his followers, it doesn't come from the women who were there, but the greatest evidence and the greatest argument comes from the religious leaders who put him to death and from a bunch of pagan soldiers who had no stake in the game. So first, I want to go through a couple theories for you. See, these were going to pop in really cool too. It's frustrating. So here's our theories. Number one, imagine there's nothing else under number one. It just popped in. There it is. It's called the lettuce theory. This is a great one. This was one of the first theories that tried to explain away the empty tomb. One of the earliest explanations by non-believers. Now, supposedly the garden at the tomb where Jesus was buried, he was upset that all these curiosity seekers were trampling over his newly planted lettuce seeds. And he was so mad that this caused him to remove the body out of the grave and go put it somewhere else. It's called the lettuce theory. And they started trying to perpetuate this. This is why the tomb was empty. There's a couple of problems that are here with this, and I hope we can begin to see what some of these problems are. Number one, we know there were guards guarding it. Number two, there was a Roman seal put on it, which means this is something you don't touch, or else it's a capital offense. We know there was a stone that weighed at least 1,000 pounds, if not more, that he had to roll away. He climbed in, he took the body out, and then we know that he folded his grave clothes nicely and set them back there. And he buried the body in another place. See, the evidence doesn't even make sense that something like that would happen, right? And why not? If they said, oh, Jesus resurrected, you could have said, no, let me tell you, I switched the tombs, here's his body, take him right to it, there it is, and it's all over. Never happens. Because the empty tomb's not the real idea, but it's seeing a resurrected Jesus that does it. Second one is what's called the swoon or coma theory. I like this one. It says Jesus wasn't really dead, he was just in a coma. They put him in a nice cool tomb and they had spices on him and he woke up and he just decided to leave. Now it's interesting because he's been beaten within an inch of his life. He's just been crucified. A Roman soldier has taken a sword and shoved it right up underneath of his ribs, so it's gone through his heart and through his lungs. Okay, he is dead. They take him down. Did they not notice any life in him when they took him down at all? They wrap him up incredibly tight in grave clothes, and they put 100 pounds of spices on top of the body. But somehow Jesus awakens in critical condition. He takes 100 pounds of spices, he unwraps himself, of course he folds it up nicely and sets it there. He's able to roll away 1,000-pound stone from the inside, and then he goes out and does all that he does, right? That's great, right? The reality doesn't make sense with that. And it's a lie that really goes back to prove the truth. The historical facts shut it down. So I guess one of my questions I have for you today is, how's the resurrection affecting your life? People go through a lot to try and say that it didn't happen. Number 3, the no burial theory. This is good, and this was truthful at the time. Criminals were very often not buried. They were just thrown in a mass grave somewhere or left there to hang upon the cross and rot, because that was a great way to show everybody you don't want to be this person right here, so they left the body there. So the fact that Jesus was actually taken down and put into a grave is a big deal. So what they said is there's no burial. They just threw him in a mass grave. That's why there was nobody at a tomb. But the reality here then is this with the problems. Joseph said, I took this man down and I buried him in my tomb. He was a very powerful, influential person in the entire nation. Okay, I see that part. The Roman guard is there. It seemed like they could have searched the mass grave very easily and found a body there within an hour, but no search was ever made. There's soldiers guarding the tomb. Do you think they know whether someone is there or not? You'd think they would if they were guarding a tomb. The historical facts shut down the theory. How's the resurrection affecting your life today? The last one's called the stolen body theory, and this one at least, it's an oldie but a goodie, believe me. But at least it's one that tries to explain away what happened to Jesus' body. Matthew 28:13. The story is this. The religious leaders get together with the guards who were guarding the tomb. They just came back and explained everything that happened. We're going to hear the story. Earthquake, an angel shows up, the tomb's opened up, and there's nobody in there. So they run back into town. And they talk to the guards, and the guards talk to the religious leaders, and the religious leaders say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a story, a lie. You're going to say you fell asleep, the disciples came and took the body. This is where we're going to go with it. Matthew 27:62-67. The religious leaders were the ones who made Pilate put a guard there and put a Roman seal on that tomb, which I think is so interesting, because we're going to find out the disciples are hiding behind locked doors. They don't even think about Jesus being resurrected. The only ones who remember Jesus said, I'll come back in 3 days, is the religious leaders who put him to death. Interesting. It's almost as if God wanted to make sure there were credible witnesses there other than the disciples to see what happened and be able to spread that news. Like as if God knew something was going to happen. I think he might have. There's some problems with the story about the stolen body theory. The problem is that the Roman soldiers were trained to be with the emperor. They're only in town there because there's been some uprisings. They're the special forces of the day. They don't fret, they don't sweat, they don't get scared. They've seen it all, they've done it all, and they certainly don't fall asleep on the job. There's 16 of them that are in a group. There's 4 of them that keep 4 watches. They're and a bunch of scared fishermen and the like. They come there, they roll away a 1,000-pound stone, they steal the body, they put the grave clothes back nice and neat, and then they get out of there, and not once did they wake up one of these sleeping soldiers that were the big people of the day, right? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? And then of course, begs the question here is, if they were sleeping, then how do they know that they came and stole the body unless one of them woke up, saw them doing it, and did nothing in it? I mean, how do you know? Oh, the disciples came and stole the body. Really? How did you see that? You were all asleep. Oh, well, no. Doesn't make any sense. You see, the Roman seal was broken. You see, this was a secure area. This is no little Jewish religious thing anymore. This is a capital crime against the nation of Rome. There were 600 to 1,000 soldiers in that city. They could have been set loose, and within an hour they could have found the body, but there was no search. It's almost like they knew the body wasn't stolen. My favorite part is this. The Bible is just painfully honest. The disciples are scared. They're hiding behind locked doors and completely unbelieving. They're clueless. You know, the women, and Luke says the women see Jesus in the empty tomb and they run and they tell the disciples, you know what the disciples say to them? They say, that's a bunch of nonsense. It's foolishness. That couldn't have happened. And they were the ones who went and took the body. See, Matthew gives us this story. The soldiers are at the tomb. An earthquake comes. An angel pops out. The tomb opens up. There's no Jesus there whatsoever. And what Matthew tells us is that the the Roman guard, they begin to lose their faculties. In fact, the very word he uses is that they literally had an earthquake within themselves and they just kind of crumbled to the ground. When they finally get themselves up where they can walk again and do what they need to do, they run into the city. Who do they run to? Pilate? No way, no how. They run to the religious leaders because the religious leaders have Pilate under their thumbs. They're in trouble. You know why they're in trouble? If you're a Roman soldier and you're guarding somebody and they escape, you take their place. But we were guarding a dead man. Yikes. 3 groups are confronted with the truth of the resurrection: the women, the guards, and the religious leaders. And 2 of them are compelled to tell the truth, and 1 of them is compelled to lie. It's an interesting thing, because the truth has no agenda. Did you know that? The truth has no agenda whatsoever. It's just truth. And it's laid out there. So we find out the women there, they see the empty tomb. They see Jesus, and they're compelled to go tell the truth, and they run into town and share it. At the exact same time, Matthew says the soldiers finally come back to themselves. They run into town, and they are compelled to tell the truth, and they report everything. In fact, Matthew gives them this intensified word for they told everything. And it's not like, well, we told everything. They told everything, which means they didn't try to candy coat it. They didn't try to come up with excuses. They didn't try to say, we weren't really scared. It was no big deal, man. They went there, and they said, earthquake, angel, empty tomb. We need clean pairs of shorts, man. We are done with this thing. They said everything. All right? Does that make sense? And you know what happened? The religious leaders believed them. And what do? Folks, we got to make up a lie. What? It's like God one last time is slapping them in the face saying, here's the truth of Jesus and all that he is. And they say, whew, we got to bury this thing immediately. Here's the story. His disciples took the body. Here's some money. Go spread it out wherever you can. We cannot let this Jesus thing get out of control. How's the resurrection affecting your life today? Man, we'll keep you out of trouble. Go tell the lie. Matthew is compelling evidence that Jesus' resurrection was real, came from the true groups that had the least to gain from it. Roman soldiers, pagan Roman soldiers who had no stake in the game, but said, this is what happened. And the people who put Jesus to death and wanted that thing to be wiped out forever. And yet that is the evidence that he gives us. It's kind of amazing. Credible evidence. You see, credible evidence can come from eyewitness testimony. It can come from a book written a long time ago. And we can believe it, and we can connect it to our faith, and we can begin to live the new life that comes from it. Because the resurrection of Jesus isn't just theoretical, it's very practical. Easter is here to change our lives, and so my question today is, where do you need the power of Easter in your life today? New life for old. Where do you need healing in your life today? Where do you need strength? Where do you need hope? Where do you need recovery? Where do you need to be set free? Where do you need forgiveness? Where do you need life as it was meant to be lived? You know, it just reminds me of the song by Switchfoot. Maybe we've been living with our eyes half open. Maybe we're bent and broken. We were meant to live for so much more. We want more than what this world has to offer. Because everything inside, it screams for second life. We were meant to live for so much more. Are we ready to live it in our lives? Today, will you begin to live with everyday resurrection power in your life? Credible evidence right there. We can get a hold of it, and that credible evidence leads us to belief, and it leads us and we connect it to our faith, and then something amazing happens. New life is lived. Way down deep living, awakening to life, to the fact that tomorrow when we climb up out of bed, the world is different because of this right here. People ask me, why do you believe in the resurrection? Here's why. It's happened in my life. I feel it, I know it, and I live it every day. Today is the day to believe and let it change your life in power. I have a last little prayer I'm going to be saying right here, and the band can come on up, and we'll be ready for this last song we're going to sing. As they're coming up, here's the prayer. Just listen to it, and just in your hearts, just follow along. Jesus, we thank you for your amazing love and grace. We thank you that you endured the cross, scorning its shame, and on the other side, you came out with true, abundant, eternal life, resurrected, ready to share it with us. Jesus, we ask you today to give us new, whole, abundant life today. We come in faith to you. We believe, and we are ready for that new power to move within us.